North Korea may be on the verge of conducting a new nuclear test. However, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is warning Kim Jong-un that exploding another nuclear device would further destabilize the region and lead to a strengthening of international sanctions against the regime. Here to discuss this and the failed policies of totalitarian and communist regimes is Daniel Martino. He's a commentator and economist with Young Voices. Daniel also serves as the founder and director of the Dissident Project. Daniel, it's good to talk with you again, and I want to discuss the work of the Dissident Project because it's so important to educate young people about the dangers of socialism. But first, new economic sanctions against North Korea. Do you think more sanctions will deter Kim Jong-un from moving forward with a new nuclear test? Your thoughts?
Unfortunately, I don't think that there's much more room to sanction North Korea. North Korea is already an economy that has self-isolated. In some sense, they have sanctioned themselves. And the U.S. will need to be able to cut off North Korea from Chinese or Russian weapon shipments and equipment. And I think that that's going to be unlikely. So I think that the only way to deter North Korea would be to actually show, like I think President Trump did, that we are stronger and more forceful, more willing to use force against them if they were to attack us.
Yeah, that seemed to work, didn't it, for a while anyway? And I know China and Russia have opposed sanctions at the UN recently. The EU and UN may need to reimpose sanctions on Iran as a result of that regime's decision to shut down cameras of their nuclear development sites. And of course, tough sanctions are already in place and kicking in against Russia because of its war in Ukraine. So just how effective, Daniel, are sanctions against despotic regimes?
I think it really depends on the case, right? So with North Korea, there's not really much more we can do. They are an economy that is totally in shambles. But Iran, Venezuela, Cuba are much more different regimes and much more different geographical and economic situations. I think that sanctions have a role in the sense that they're not going to overthrow the regime, the sanctions. That's the mistake that people make if thinking that they do. The role of the sanctions is to reduce the revenue resources of each of these evil regimes such that they can't do more damage outside of their home, outside of their territory, right? Such that Iran doesn't have enough money to build nuclear weapons, or such that the Venezuelan regime doesn't have enough money to buy weapons to oppress its people. But it's not going to overthrow them.
Well, let's talk about Venezuela. Because of their human rights records, President Biden did not invite Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela to the Summit of the Americas last week. Yet because of sanctions on Russia, Biden's looking to ease sanctions, or already has to some extent, against Nicolas Maduro and Venezuela for oil. Is there a bit of inconsistency here? What do you think?
Well, I think that the administration is trying to appear good and on the side of democracy, while at the same time, unfortunately, appeasing these dictators. And it's a terrible mistake because there's no reason to allow Maduro to profit from oil exports to the EU or to anywhere else. If they do this, it's just going to give more money to these cronies and these evil people. So the sanctions on Venezuela are very different from the sanctions on, say, Iran or Cuba, in that they're targeted at the members of the regime and at the state economy, not at the private economy. You can send things to Venezuela very easily and no problems with that. And so I think that we should continue that.
And we're not really talking about that much oil, are we?
Well, it's not like Venezuela can produce much more, but unfortunately what Maduro is doing is that he has invited Chinese, Iranian, and Russian companies to extract our Venezuelan oil. In some sense, these supposedly anti-imperialist regimes are the ones that have allowed foreign state powers to take our natural resources.
Daniel, tell us about the Dissident Project that you have founded. Why did you start it, and what do you hope to accomplish?
Yeah, well, so the viewers and listeners can know a little bit about this. The Dissident Project is the first ever speakers bureau composed entirely of young immigrants who came from socialist countries to the United States. We have 8 people who came from Cuba, Venezuela, North Korea, and Hong Kong. And we're going to travel to schools at no cost all over the United States, high schools more specifically, to tell our stories and connect it to what's happening in America so that students learn what's the history of socialism, why is this such a terrible system, and why we should always avoid it in America. In the same way we learn about the history of fascism, of slavery, and of other political systems, we have to learn about socialism, the system that has killed the largest number of people in world history.
And do you really think you're going to get into some of these schools? I mean, socialism is spreading throughout our public school system. Do they want to hear about it?
Well, in the first place, Florida passed a law that requires every high school to teach against socialism and communism. And that includes firsthand experiences and a lesson of at least 45 minutes every year in every high school in the state of Florida. So that is already 2,000 high schools that are legally required to teach about this. And we're providing them a resource of firsthand experience at no cost to them. But beyond that, there are schools that have teachers that are not socialists. Most of them, right? Almost all of them, probably.
Okay, hearing firsthand from some young voices, dissidents, who actually experienced socialism firsthand in their home countries. Daniel D. Martino, Dissident Project Director and Young Voices commentator. Thank you, Daniel. Always a pleasure talking to you.
Likewise, Gary.